Before you is an animatronic found in the back alley. We are unsure of its origins.
Oh my god, Springtrap is back. This is so cool, I'm so glad he's back. I wonder what he's going to look like. What the f? Hey guys, I'm Drago, and I think we can all agree that Scraptrap is probably the biggest downgrade in video game history. We went from the peak that is Springtrap to this peanut over here. And I think a lot of the fandom agrees that he's not the best design out there. For me, I don't like him that much, but I would admit there are times that he does look quite cool. But I do very much prefer Springtrap's design over Scraptrap's design, and I thought it might be fun to redesign Scraptrap. You know how I've been doing this redesign series with Banban. I wanted to do some more redesigns, not just Banban. So here we are. This video I will be redesigning Scraptrap. I'm going to first sort of analyse and break down his design and sort of give my opinions on it before we get into the drawing. So if you want to skip, then timestamp will be on screen now for where you can skip to for that. But yeah, my general opinion of Scraptrap. I don't absolutely hate him, but I don't particularly like him either. I think a huge problem with Scraptrap's design is his proportions. If you put him side by side with Springtrap, obviously you can tell that Scott was going for a new suit, but the proportions just don't really work. Scraptrap is supposed to be a Springlock suit, and a Springlock suit I personally don't think should be that skinny. You gotta think that it's gotta fit both a person in there and all the Springlock mechanisms and the endo and all that, and I just don't see that being possible at all within Scraptrap. If you look at Springtrap, he's a little bit bulkier to allow for that space. You can tell it would still be quite a squeeze, but it realistically fits. Scraptrap just looks like a human could barely fit in there, and you'd have to be a sort of fairly skinny human to fit in that. So I think the proportions is probably the biggest problem with his design, especially when you look at the head, and I think his head is just a bit too big. Or not so much that his head is too big, but rather the ears are too small, and I think that makes his head look too big, especially his forehead. I mean, we all know he's got quite the big forehead right there. Other design choices, I can see where Scott was going with them. I can see how it works. One thing I don't understand is the bone ears or bone lungs or anything like that. I guess he's probably trying to go with the mummified corpse way, but he made it out of bone. It didn't really work, so yeah, that sort of needs changing, I think. Other than that, a lot of redesigning him is going to be mostly on fixing the proportions. Honestly, he's not awful. There are times where he does look really ugly, but other times he actually looks really quite creepy, especially in Salvage when he's sort of leant back in the dark and he's got this very hollow look to him. That is a really cool shot. That is when he looks quite cool. This design works in some areas but doesn't work in other areas. It works if he's lurking in the dark. It doesn't work if he's sort of in your face in the light, which means the jump scare just looks awful. So with all that said, let's sort of move on to experimenting with how I'm going to approach this redesign. Much like I did for the Threadbare design video that I did a few weeks back, I got Springtrap and Scraptrap here, and I decided to sort of look at their shapes and how they're built. And I actually got very similar results to the Threadbare video. When you look at Springtrap, he is a lot more curved, he's a lot rounder, his edges are a lot smoother. He's built up of a lot of curves and circles. There's not many hard edges to him, there's not many angles, not many points, he's just a very smooth design in general. Looking at Scraptrap, you can see he's a lot more square. He has a lot more sort of corners and angles to him, especially around his muzzle and jaw. While you can draw Springtrap with circles, you can draw Scraptrap with squares, basically. The two designs are very contrasting to each other, and while I understand that Scraptrap is most likely a new suit within the lore, I do prefer it to be a bit more consistent with Springtrap, to just really nail home that he was Springtrap before, he got burned, he's now Scraptrap. Sort of keep that continuity in there. So it was sort of going to be a way that I needed to merge Springtrap and Scraptrap together without getting rid of the essence of Scraptrap. Because while Scraptrap isn't the best design, there are parts of him that are good, and I don't want to just make him Springtrap more withered. That's something I did in the past with a redesign for Scraptrap, and I don't really like that anymore. I now think it is better to keep the essence of Scraptrap in terms of like his face shape, his general body shape, his design. Just sort of fix things up, fix up the proportions and all that. So yeah, basically it was just going to be merging Springtrap and Scraptrap while making sure I don't completely override Scraptrap's features with Springtrap. If that makes sense. Probably not. I hope that makes sense. So the first big change I did with Scraptrap was change his muzzle. Now the way I draw Springtrap is I will always sort of connect the muzzle lines to his eyes. It's this nice sort of smooth muzzle, and it sort of shows how he's got a muzzle that's a bit more like Bonnie, in that it doesn't really have this harsh edge. It sort of curves up smoothly into the rest of his face. If you look at Bonnie, you'll see what I mean. And I do that with Springtrap and Spring Bonnie, and I wanted to keep that consistent with Scraptrap because it's sort of the rabbit style of Fazbear Entertainment. So I started off with some construction lines. Didn't really like how it was going at first, honestly. I just couldn't quite get him right. So it took a lot of trial and error. It took a lot of just redrawing it, redoing it. I was sort of trying to go classic Scraptrap pose here. The next big design change was changing the proportions. I bulked out his body a lot more, made it more consistent with how bulky Springtrap is himself, while trying not to make him too bulky because he's definitely not the bulkiest animatronic, but he is at least bulkier than how Scraptrap is depicted, I reckon. When I got into the actual sketching, I wanted to sort of keep the rhythm a bit more consistent with Springtrap. While parts have been replaced, I don't think entire parts have been replaced, at least not in my interpretation of him. So parts of the mask have been replaced, but not all of it. Therefore, some of the old rhythm from Springtrap is still there, and it is now likely more withered and burned away from the fire. So that's one thing I was going for. Another big design change in his head was changing where the top of the head intersects with the muzzle. So on the original Scraptrap, the head sort of ends where the top of his muzzle is, and then the jaw sort of starts halfway down his muzzle, and that looks really weird. I think that's a big reason why he looks so weird. It looks like his head is sort of cut in half. It doesn't really work. So here I kept it more that the end of the head ends at the bottom of the muzzle and the jaw starts below the muzzle. Basically more like Springtrap. I also tried to make the endo more consistent with Springtrap. While parts of the suit were changed, it's unlikely the parts of the endo were. William is fused to this endo. I don't think he can get any of that out, so the endoskeleton I kept more consistent with Springtrap, the Spring endoskeleton, and I tried to remember where some of the wires on Springtrap were and just added more of those as well. It was all about making it consistent, making the continuity work a bit better. I also adapted the skeleton to just be a bit more realistic, I guess, a bit more human-like. I don't fault Scott for that though, because let me tell you, drawing humans is a pain, so I can imagine modelling humans is even worse. So like, I'm not gonna rat on Scott for not being able to model a human because I can't draw humans. It absolutely sucks. So I understand his pain there. I also got rid of the sharp teeth because I don't know, I just don't think sharp teeth on the suit itself really fit. Why would the suits have sharp teeth? It's always sort of been the endoskeleton. If it has sharp teeth, the endoskeleton will have those teeth, not the suit itself. So I just gave him the normal squared off teeth that Springtrap has, but I also did give him a couple of buck teeth like Scraptrap. Moving on to the rest of the body, it was again keeping the withering sort of consistent with Springtrap. It was thinking about what parts would still be Springtrap, what parts would be new, and in the end I decided that most of it is still going to be Springtrap, except for the head is somewhat changed. He's got a new pelvis because, as we know from Dark Springtrap, at the end of Sister Location he was missing his pelvis, and a new foot is probably the other thing. Other than that, he was keeping it consistent with Springtrap and making the withering more so now because he's been through a fire, so things are going to be burned away and charred. As I went on though, I thought it might be cool to sort of show where he's possibly tried to patch some things up, and so I started to add metal bars that he's possibly riveted onto himself to try and keep some things in place, things that are possibly fallen off, as well as scraps of suits that he's found, probably scraps from the Scraptrap suit that he would have found and used to patch himself up. Maybe that suit was quite decayed and not enough for him to fully patch himself up, so he just had to take parts of it. So I added both the metal bars that he's used to keep parts together and the patches of fabric he's used to possibly get rid of some of the holes and stuff. I just thought doing that really adds to the name Scraptrap. If you look at the other scrap animatronics other than Lefty, you can see that they have taken parts they've salvaged and found around to rebuild themselves almost. Molten Freddy has got a mask made out of random stuff that he's made himself. And Scrap Baby, you can tell she's built herself back up to resemble more being Baby rather than just a blob of wires that she would have been after being ejected from Ennard. So Scraptrap salvaging parts to sort of repair himself and change himself really fits into that lore. So I want to make that clear that he has salvaged, he has built himself up, he is made of scrap, which is why he is Scraptrap. Doing this line art, let me tell you, it took so long to do. These lines turned out way more detailed than I expected them to. Took me a good couple of hours to get this line art done, but honestly, doing detailed line art is really satisfying. It just adds so much more depth when you get to your colouring and stuff, and it really helps you follow these shapes and textures, especially on the withered parts where I do the little cracks. It helps me sort of realise that this is probably a bit more of a 3D shape one than just a flat bit, so it's better to sort of show where the crack is, put some sort of darkness there to show that there's probably a tiny bit of a gap now. It probably doesn't make sense, it makes sense in my head, but as much as at the time I find doing line art tedious, once it's done it's really satisfying to look at the finished result. In terms of colouring him, Springtrap and Scraptrap have a fairly different colour palette. You wouldn't think it's that different, but it is when you put them side by side. Springtrap is more towards green, he's a lot darker. Scraptrap has a more yellowy hue to him, and he's got a lot more saturated, brighter colours. So it's going to be sort of blending those two together. Like I said before, this is basically a mix of the old Springtrap suit and newer suit parts that would make Scraptrap. And so, while the old parts would be more Springtrap's colour, the newer parts would be more Scraptrap's colour. And I think this would contrast nicely in order to make sure that it's clear which parts are new, which parts are old. At first I wasn't quite sure it was going to work because the flat colour looked quite weird with it. As soon as I got into pasting the texture, it really started to come together. Before doing that though, I decided to move one of his knees. Yeah, I took away his kneecap. I just thought little scraps of fabric like that have probably been burned away by the fire. It just adds a bit more depth to the design is all. Now when texturing him, I did want to lean more into making the Scraptrap parts brighter, not as saturated and bright as the original, but just a bit brighter to show they are slightly newer. Well, not so much newer, but like they weren't in a fire. Meanwhile, the Springtrap parts, rather than sort of going proper greens and stuff, I actually made the hues I use quite grey. I wanted him to look burned and ashy, and really contrast the old parts with the new parts. Just sort of try and really nail home that this guy was in a fire, and you can see why he got so damaged, you can see why he had to replace parts. So with the more grey hues, I made him look quite ashy, and later on I even added some scorch marks here and there. It's just a nice contrast is all. Other things I did with texturing was I added a bit of sort of red flesh on the bones, just to show that he was more like a skinned mummified corpse at first, but the fire has sort of burned most of that away by now. It is now mostly exposed bone other than the other fleshy parts around him, and those fleshy parts being more in the protected areas. But if he had to replace the suit's head, then it's likely that most of that got burned away in the fire. Therefore his human head would have been quite exposed. That probably would have all been burned away. Probably not quite hot enough to turn bone to ash, but enough to sort of get rid of the flesh that he had left. So he's got quite the exposed skull, but there are still some scraps of flesh on there here and there. And with the endoskeleton I do this for Springtrap, I decided to do it here. I added a bit of rust. Very likely this endo has gone rusty by this point, especially since he was originally kept in quite a damp area. So yeah, just a little detail to just help bring it all together. With his eyes, I kept the lenses that Springtrap has. And now in my own sort of AU version that I've got that I'm writing, Scraptrap actually ends up going partially blind or just mostly blind. And so I kept sort of one eye more like the Springtrap eye, sort of an eye that's more functioning, and that is the eye that has the eyelid more open. The other eye I sort of made darker, I made the pupil smaller. It's more dull, it looks more like it's just not working, and that fits with the eyelid sort of drooping over it a bit more than the other eye. I really just want to nail home the damage that this guy's gone through at this point. And once all the texturing was done, it was onto shading, which was just adding a couple of layers. Nothing too detailed because it's more just a concept piece rather than a full detailed drawing. But just enough to sort of add a bit of depth and separate areas from each other. And it just really brought the whole piece together. And there we go, that is my redesign of Scraptrap. I really like how it turned out actually. This is way better than the old Scraptrap redesign I did way back when. I'll have that on screen now. I literally just basically took Springtrap and removed his arm, made him a bit more withered. It really didn't look good. Even Oof Troop in his redesign video of Scraptrap put my old art in there like, this is not how you do it. And I totally agree with him. Like, back then, I thought that was the best way to do it because I just absolutely hated Scraptrap. But now I sort of see the merits of Scraptrap design. I see where he works quite well. I see the pros of it. I see the reasons for parts of the design, why Scott maybe chose that. And I don't hate him as much as I used to, honestly. I still think he's not a great design. I still think there's ways that he could have been done way better. But I don't despise him anymore. And I think that going the route of making it more like Scraptrap, just editing things to sort of fix up what is wrong with him, such as the proportions and things, that is the way to go. That is how you fix Scraptrap. I don't like saying that because I don't want to discredit what Scott did, but that is how you sort of get Scraptrap to be more consistent with Springtrap, more enjoyable for the fans, I guess. I don't know. I'm trying not to be mean here. I don't want to be mean. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you want more redesign videos, comment down below what you would like to see me redesign. You know, characters from any game or movie or book or whatever. Just, you know, give me something. And if you enjoyed, maybe leave a like and subscribe. I'd really, really appreciate it if you did. And I hope you will have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!